Human mortality is a problem that we all face. So there's a question of where can we look for a solution? And we might think, well, where do we look for answers? We can look on the internet. We can use Google or we can use some other search engine and see what it tells us. Now, in a few moments, we're actually going to have a look at the sort of results that you get if you type in those search criteria, Mortality Solved. So just put those two into a search engine and see what you get. But first, let's have a think about attitudes to death in general and to a death when it's affected somebody near you or has affected you in your family. For just a moment. So, attitudes to death. I personally have experienced 3 deaths of close family members in recent years. In each case, it was a relief from suffering and the death of someone with the hope of the solution that we're going to look at tonight. Generally, a funeral is an opportunity to celebrate somebody's life and their achievements. In some cases, a death is in tragic circumstances. Not infrequently, there's a feeling of guilt, and that might be rational or sometimes irrational. When a colleague is affected by death, we may feel embarrassed and afraid to talk to them, although in most cases they need somebody to talk to. There are those who can keep their sense of humour even in death. And we find in the military that people are trained for this. Although such humour may totally collapse when it affects some loved one who's very close to them. There is an instinctive fear built into us of situations that may lead to death. And of course, some people see death as some sort of new beginning, some sort of life after death. And others at the opposite extreme see it as the total end of existence. Well, what happens when I search the internet? We find that internet search engines don't have the solution. I just picked those 2 keywords, solved and mortality, and we can see the sort of thing that I found. The solutions we find are about how to understand death statistics. Google and other search engines are just not helpful if we want to solve mortality itself. Now, here are some questions, frequently asked questions that people may ask in search of the solution. Do we have an immortal soul? What happens after we die? Do we go to heaven? And then, if so, what is heaven like? Or alternatively, are we reincarnated? And then what is resurrection? And when would that happen? And why, some might ask, would we want to live forever? And the typical answers that we find to these questions don't help much. Somebody saying that we have an immortal soul doesn't make it true. So we're going to have a look at what the Bible teaches, and we're going to investigate some of these. What is the soul? We're going to look at mortality and immortality, heaven and hell, of who might qualify for eternal life, and some sort of vision of what eternal life is about. So these are things that we can learn from the Bible, and we're going to dig into some of these. Well, what we actually find in the Bible might surprise some of you. And we ask the question, how many verses of the Bible say that the soul is immortal? Or perhaps of a phrase like immortal soul? And the answer is none. We might ask the question of, do souls die? And I can quote you here from the Bible. I picked one verse in the Bible here, Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 4. Behold, all souls are mine. This is obviously God speaking through the prophet here. All souls are mine. as the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son is mine. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. And so the Bible message there is that souls die, never that souls are immortal. So how does the Bible describe our state as human beings? And we find this if we look at Genesis chapter 13, verse 19, we see the message that God gave to Adam after Adam sinned. So here's Adam, who had been created from the dust of the earth. God breathed into him the breath of life. Now that word breath and spirit, the same word. So the spirit, the breath, was breathed into him. So the body of dust became a living body. And then what's going to happen next? Because Adam sinned, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. The spirit or breath taken away by God, and all that man is dust. No immortal soul here. That word, as I said, the word often translated spirit is the same word as breath or wind. It's just the breath. God put breath into the dust, the man made of dust, and man turns back to dust. And we find that if we actually look at where a body's been and decayed and rotted, that's what it turns into. When we do the vacuuming at home, the vacuum cleaner, they're full of dust. Where's the dust come from? Well, a lot of it is there come from us, from our skin scales. We turn into dust. And then we have Psalm 146, verse 3. The Bible again describes our state. Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help. His breath goeth forth, he returneth to his earth. In that very day his thoughts perish. So in death, the thoughts perish. So we're not getting a message here that sounds much like a message that's getting closer to the solution, does it? We've looked at our Bibles and we've not found an immortal soul. We've not found, if we look further, we won't find ideas of immortal souls going to heaven or to hell. And we find here the message that you just turn to dust, your thoughts perish, and that's the end. So that might sound a bit disappointing so far. We're looking for a solution to mortality, but let's not give up. Let's try a bit further. Well, we find quite a list of verses in the Bible that refer to death as sleep. So the idea we see in these verses is the idea that death, whilst it is an end of that conscious thought, that the thoughts perish, that there is an awakening from that sleep. So let's just pick one of these verses, and we're going to go to Daniel chapter 12 in the Old Testament and verse 2. And the Bible talks there of a day of resurrection. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So we need to have a close look at that verse, because we find several ideas in that verse. One, it doesn't say all. It says many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth. So those who are sleeping in the dust of the earth, those whose bodies have turned to dust, that some of those are going to awake on that day of resurrection. They're going to be raised back to life. And some of them, again, note the word some, not all. So many are raised, not all. And some of them, not all of them that are raised, get everlasting life, and some get shame and everlasting contempt. And on that last bit, note that they don't get the everlasting life. Some get the everlasting life. Those who get the shame and everlasting contempt are not getting everlasting life. We might have great contempt for certain people in history. We can think of Adolf Hitler, that there is great contempt continuing for him, and in years and years to come. We can imagine the contempt for Adolf Hitler, but that doesn't make him alive. And so it is here that some receive everlasting life and some shame and everlasting contempt. They don't receive the life. So some might say, well, what about this? Matthew chapter 6, verse 20. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, for where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through, nor steal. They say, right, we've got you there, look. Lay up your treasures in heaven. And there are verses in the Bible that are presented like this to say this is like absolute proof that we go to heaven at death. Although that would be a big problem, because that would contradict what we've just read from the Bible, the idea that we go into the dust of the earth, our thoughts perish, and then there is that hope of reawakening on a day of resurrection to be raised back to life. But if we go to heaven or hell at death, then there would have to be that judgment at the time of death. And also, if we got an immortal soul that went to heaven, then the idea of eternal life as a reward for some would also be a contradiction. So we need to think about this verse a little bit more. Well, I store some of my treasures, if you like, in the bank. I put my money in the bank, and these days it's more electronic, but in terms of money that's cash, the pound coins and the £10 notes and £20 notes, or whatever that you might deposit in the bank, your treasure, that is put in the bank vault. So if Jesus, instead of advising about treasures that he's talking about, like spiritual treasures, if he was talking about the bank and he said, lay up for yourselves your treasures in the bank, would you take that as absolute proof that you were going to go and live in the bank forever, or that you're in fact going to live in the bank at any time and live in the bank vault? It wouldn't make sense, would it? So if we just read the verse like that, it's saying put your treasures in heaven, and the reason for your treasures being there is to keep them somewhere safe, where not moth and rust don't corrupt and where thieves don't break through or steal. So if we compare heaven and the analogy of that with money put into a bank, the verse would just not make sense as being some sort of proof that we go to heaven. It's more a place of safe storage. So let's go to the next verses that we've got here, because the person might say, well, I've got you here with John chapter 14, verse 2. In my Father's house are many mansions, or many dwelling places in a modern version. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. Yes, he's going to go into heaven to prepare a place for us. Well, there's a few problems there, because if we look through our Bibles, we'll find typically that when it talks of my Father's house or the house of God, it's talking about something that's on earth. We could go to, and perhaps we won't turn to this, but the first letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 5, where the community of believers is referred to as a spiritual house. And so the house of God doesn't of necessity mean heaven. What about Jesus going, though, to prepare a place? Well, we go to the next verse, verse 3. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. So that we can be with Jesus, he's coming back. And if we've all gone to heaven, then we're all left behind when he comes back, because he says he's coming again. He's returning. And just as was promised in the prophecy of Daniel and in other prophecies, he's coming back to raise the dead. And so we can see, say, he's going to prepare a place and then come again to receive us unto him. So he's going to come here to earth to receive us unto him. And of course, that implies that we're not going to be with him before that time. So until he returns, we're not with him. It's so that we can be with him when he it says, receives us unto himself when he's returned. So that verse 3 particularly strengthens the message to say we're looking for the time of that reward from heaven when Jesus returns. He's preparing it. He's got everything in store so that he can be with us when he returns. So when, we might say, is the judgment. And here in Paul's second letter, we see the dead will be judged when Jesus returns. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. Writing to Timothy, Paul says, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick or the living and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom. So the judging is going to occur of the quick, and that in modern translation, living, judge the living and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom. So when he returns to set up his kingdom, that's when he's going to do the judging. So again, if we went to heaven or hell at death, that would require the judgment to take place at the time of death, which would contradict here Paul's letter. It would contradict parables that Jesus told, like the parable of the talents, where the master goes away and then comes back to judge his servants. So we can see the parables of Jesus, and the message of Paul is about the judgment happening at the time when Jesus returns to set up his kingdom. Well, the Bible, of course, does claim that there is a solution to mortality, and that one man has been resurrected from the dead to be alive forevermore, namely Jesus Christ. Well, a man called Frank Morrison decided to look at the evidence with the intention of disproving the resurrection. The problem he had is that he found, as he looked at the evidence, that it wasn't supporting in the direction that he'd intended. He actually found that the evidence won him over to the opposite conclusion. You see, the Jewish authorities claimed that the disciples had come to the tomb whilst the guards were sleeping. And we saw in our reading today how they bribed the guards. Now, the credibility of such a claim was essentially zero, as we'll see. However, the claim that we find helps to confirm that Jesus was a real man who was crucified, and after this, his body was put in a tomb. And again, that was something unusual for a person who had been crucified. The Bible account, which says that the guards were bribed and the priests then promised to straighten things up with Pilate, could have been countered by a report of the execution of the guards, as they would normally have suffered the death penalty for being asleep on the job, but it wasn't so. There's also this question of how the guards would know that the disciples had come and taken the body if the soldiers were asleep. So the argument that was put forward by the Jews around that time to say that the disciples had stolen the body, that clearly just didn't work. There's a lot of other problems with this idea of the disciples coming to steal the body, because they were clearly demoralized and afraid. They had expected Jesus as their Lord to set up God's kingdom at that time, and instead he had allowed himself to be taken and put to death. So how would they then, these demoralized, fearful men, organize a plot to remove the body? And what a coincidence that they should be happening to carry out this daring raid, and the soldiers happening to be asleep at the time, and the soldiers somehow, as I say in the claim, happening to see them stealing the body when they were asleep. So we can see that, and I've just really scratched the surface. You'll have to read his book to actually see a lot more. But we can see that there are problems with the argument of the body being stolen whilst the soldiers were sleeping, say particularly as the death penalty was applied. But there is another alternative to explain away the resurrection, and that is called the swoon theory. Now, this one actually is one that really is quite easy to overcome, because we have the idea here that here's a man who was first scourged, he was beaten to the point of being half dead. So at that point of being scourged, you were sort of now barely alive. He's then taken and nailed with large Roman nails to a cross, where he hangs for hours. He then eventually is taken as being dead by the soldiers. Now, the way that the cross worked is that if you failed to support yourself with your legs and sort of collapsed, that then there was a terrific strain on the ability to breathe, so that you would rapidly asphyxiate. And those soldiers would know their job, and they'd taken him as being dead. But just to make sure, they would, in this case, ram a spear in the side of the person. So they'd ram this spear deep into his side, and so that fluids ran out. The body was then put in the tomb, wrapped in grave clothes, and was there 3 days without water. So the swoon theory says that after being scourged, beaten half to death, nailed to the cross for several hours, where he collapsed into a state appearing to be dead, and in a way hanging in a way that would make sure he was dead, and then being judged as dead by the soldiers, and a spear being rammed in his side so that fluids ran out, and left for 3 days in the tomb, that he then awoke, somehow managed to work his way out of these grave clothes. And remember, he's had these massive nails through his hands and his feet. So he now leaps up and goes to that stone, and with his hands rolls back this large, heavy stone, which probably would be uphill, because it'd be designed so you rolled it down and it seals the tomb. And somehow, having rolled that stone up, he manages to run away and evade the guards. Well, people who presented this swoon theory say this is their alternative because they don't believe in miracles. Now, this rather contradicts itself, because for somebody who's been beaten half to death, hung on a cross, so spear rammed in his side so that fluids ran out, left for 3 days, wrapped in grave clothes, and then managing to get out of them, roll away a heavy stone and run away evading the guards, that with itself would be a miracle. So the swoon theory, I would suggest we can just absolutely dismiss. It's just not a practical idea. There's another problem we have if we oppose the idea of the resurrection of Jesus, which is this highly improbable spread of the gospel across the Roman Empire. What motivated the disciples to set themselves up to be hated and persecuted? We're not talking here of some modern evangelical American TV show type religion of persuading people to pay lots of money and somebody making lots of money out of it. These were people who were heavily opposed by their own people, the Jews, and later by the Romans. They were traveling through into dangerous parts of the empire, willing to die to spread the gospel. And what had suddenly happened to transform them? And then there was Saul of Tarsus. He was their greatest enemy. And he becomes another one of our witnesses, because he hated Christians. He was traveling to Damascus on the mission of rounding them up, to imprison them and to do whatever he could to put them to death. And then by the time he gets to the end of the journey, he's then claiming that the resurrected Jesus had appeared to him. And he then became the greatest missionary ever. He had little to gain, everything to lose. He was described as a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was a great man in the Pharisee religion. with great achievements, we can see, and a great future, and he gave up everything. Well, you can see he had little to gain and everything to lose. So on the next slide, again, we're going to see the suffering during his missionary work. So here's what he gave up. He gave up a brilliant career for this. And we can see the highlights of the Jews. 5 times received like 40 stripes. So thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. Day and night have I been in the deep, in journeyings, often in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. So as I say, this just wasn't some TV evangelist making loads of money out of this. This was somebody who gave up a great career for and lost all of his friends. All of his achievements would be counted as nothing, and he faced all of this. And clearly something, as he said, it was the appearing of Jesus to him that persuaded him. So we have here the message of mortality has been solved. We have the evidence of the enemies of Jesus, who by their actions actually demonstrated to us the evidence that Jesus was a real man who really was crucified. The evidence in the transformation of the disciples, the evidence in the transformation of Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul. And I haven't mentioned this yet, I've put in brackets at the bottom, evidence of the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. And we're going to look at these from Psalm 22 and from Zechariah chapter 12. So first of all, Psalm 22, verse 16. For dogs have compassed me, and I'll just explain, if you look again in the Gospels, you'll see that the term dogs was used for Gentiles and particularly for the Romans, who of course were the ones who did the actual physical putting of Jesus to death. Verse 16, for dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. Now this was written many hundreds of years before Jesus was born. At the time when Jesus was born, the Old Testament scriptures had already been translated into Greek, into the Septuagint Greek version. So we've now got this Psalm 22 not only existing in the Hebrew Bible, but in Bibles throughout the Roman Empire, translated into Greek. So there was no denying this. There was no saying this was written afterwards. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. And you can imagine the way you'd be stretched out on the cross, your bones, particularly somebody who was fairly lightweight, you'd see the bones sort of almost sticking out. And they'd look and stare upon him there, up high up on the cross. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture, which is recorded that the Roman soldiers did this in the Gospels. But what is also amazing is at the end of this psalm, what it says, verse 27, all the ends of the world shall remember and turn unto the Lord, and all the kindreds of the nations shall worship before thee. Now that is quite amazing, because it talks of what this man's going to do, and it says there that a result of this is going to be people from the ends of the world, throughout the world, turning unto the Lord. Now at the time of Psalm 22, we've got a little country called Israel, which was very much isolated from the nations around it, because when they were doing right, they worshipped God. Only when they failed did they start to link with the nations around them and worship idols. There was no concept at the time, you can imagine in people's minds, of the idea of the nations around all turning to God. That was just something that would seem very, very strange. Here was little besieged Israel with all these idolatrous nations around them, but through the action of this man, there were going to be people throughout the world, right across the world, who would turn to worship God. And then verse 31, they shall come and shall declare his righteousness unto a people that shall be born, that he hath done this. So it's not only saying it's going to be throughout the world, but throughout these future generations of people to come like us, that what he did would be proclaimed. So again, more evidence of the genuineness of the resurrection of Jesus. That mortality, it was not only solved in the time of Jesus, but we were told many hundreds of years before he was born that there was going to be his action that would solve this problem. And then Zechariah chapter 12. I'll just read verse 10. And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications. And they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. So we see in Zechariah 12 the same sort of principle. He's speaking of somebody who's been pierced and is later accepted by the people who have pierced him. And when we read the chapter, we can see there the house of David, inhabitants of Jerusalem, that the Jews, it's telling us, are one day going to accept the one who they pierced. And I'm sure we can all understand that. So these Old Testament verses in Psalm 22 and Zechariah 12 indicate that the crucifixion of Jesus was not some unplanned event. It was part of God's plan, and that plan includes the return of Jesus and his acceptance by Israel as their Messiah. Well, as we approach our conclusion, we want to look at mortality, and we see that mortality has been solved, but we find that there are conditions. Mark chapter 16, verse 16, and I've highlighted there, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned or condemned. So in Mark 16, verse 16, we find two requirements: belief and the act of faith, which is baptism. There is, of course, much more to the life of a follower of Jesus after they've been baptized, following his commandments. But these are the first steps to salvation, the necessary steps, that if you want to be saved, you've got to believe and you've got to be baptized. And I don't want to go into christening, but this again shows a big problem with christening is that the baby may be sort of what's been rebranded as baptism, although that isn't really baptism. Baptism is immersion, but the baby can't believe. So a baby that has been christened, even if that was baptism, not believing, they're under that second clause, which is he that believeth not shall be condemned. So belief is required, and true baptism, which is again not tonight's subject. So more about the conditions. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus, who shall judge the living and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom. That there is to be a judgment because of that conditionality, to say who is going to be in the given immortal life and who not. Daniel 12, verse 2, we've already looked at. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, and some to everlasting life, but some don't get everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So Daniel shows us here the two outcomes of the judgment. So I'd just like to finish now, and I'll just say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.